Level 2 Fitness Instruction, Anatomy and Physiology. The muscular system. By the end of this session, you will be able to identify the 3 types of muscle tissue, define the characteristics and functions of the 3 types of muscle, describe the basic structure of skeletal muscle, name and locate the anterior skeletal muscles and the posterior skeletal muscles, describe the structure and function of the pelvic floor muscles, describe the different types of muscle action, identify the joint actions brought about by specific muscle groups, and identify skeletal muscle fibre types and their characteristics. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal muscle is a form of striated muscle tissue. It's attached to bone and under the voluntary control of the somatic nervous system. Smooth muscle is a form of non-striated muscle tissue that contracts the internal organs such as the digestive system and the blood vessels. It is under involuntary control by the autonomic nervous system. Cardiac muscle is a striated form of muscle tissue only found in the heart and under involuntary control by the autonomic nervous system. The structure of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is a very complex structure. It has many different components to it. The first component is the tendon. The tendon is what actually attaches the muscle belly to bone. When muscles contract, they pull on tendons and pull on the bones to create movement. We also have something called fascia. Fascia is what surrounds the entire muscle and keeps everything together. If you're to cut through the fascia, you'd get to the fasciculi. Fasciculi are collections of muscle fibres. If you're to cut through the fasciculi, you'd get your muscle fibres. If you're to cut through the muscle fibres, you would get the myofibril. Now there's actually different types of fascia that hold all this together. First of all, we have the epimysium. The epimysium is what holds the entire muscle belly together. Then we have something called the perimysium. The perimysium is what holds the fasciculi together. Then we have the endomysium. The endomysium is what holds the muscle fibre together. Within the myofibril, you have sarcomeres. Sarcomeres contain 2 protein filaments, myosin and actin, also known as myofilaments. During a muscle contraction, myosin and actin filaments slide over each other, creating a shortening of the sarcomere and in turn the whole muscle. This is known as sliding filament theory. Here we have 2 diagrams, one of a sarcomere that is relaxed, one of a sarcomere that is contracted. In the first diagram, you can see that the actin and the myosin are further apart. In the second diagram, you can see that the myosin and the actin are closer towards each other. This is because during sliding filament theory, when the muscle contracts, myosin attaches itself to the actin and pulls it towards it. When this happens, the actin slides over the myosin, causing the whole muscle to contract or to shorten. There are over 600 muscles in the human body. This section goes through the main muscles that are involved in movement. To begin with, we're going to look at the anterior skeletal muscles. These are the muscles found at the front of the body. Deltoids. These are the muscles of the shoulder. Biceps brachii. This is the muscle on the front of the upper arm. Pectoralis major. These are the muscles of the chest. Rectus abdominis. These are the muscles of the abdomen. Internal obliques. These are located on the sides of the abdomen. They're found deep beneath the surface, not visible from the outside of the body. External obliques. The sides of the abdomen, close to the surface. These are visible from the outside of the body. Transversus abdominis. This is located on the front and the sides of the abdomen. They're found deep beneath the surface and not visible from the outside of the body. Hip flexors. These are the muscles that are located through the pelvis and onto the femur. Adductor group. This is the group of muscles on the inside of the thigh. Quadriceps group. These are the muscles that are located on the front of the thigh. Tibialis anterior. These are the muscles that are located on the front of the lower leg. Now we're going to look at the posterior skeletal muscles. These are the muscles that are found on the back of the skeleton. Triceps brachii. These are the muscles on the back of the upper arm. Latissimus dorsi. These are the muscles on the side of the back. Trapezius. These are the muscles of the upper back. Rhomboids. These are the muscles of the mid-back. Erector spinae. These are the muscles that run either side of the spine. Gluteus maximus. These are the muscles of the buttocks. Abductor group, gluteus medius and minimus. These are the muscles of the outside upper thigh and hips. Hamstrings group. These are the muscles on the back of the thigh. Gastrocnemius. These are the muscles on the back of the lower leg, what we call the calf, visible from the outside of the body. Soleus. These are the muscles on the back of the lower leg, the calf, not visible from outside of the body. The structure and function of the pelvic floor muscles. The pelvic floor muscles are a small group of muscles found underneath the pelvis. They form a muscular sling-like structure from the pubis to the coccyx. They support the pelvic organs such as the bladder and the intestines. They maintain continence, facilitate the birthing process, and they can become damaged during pregnancy and birth. Pelvic floor exercises can help improve their function. There are different types of muscle action. Concentric, also known as positive, is where the muscle contracts to overcome a resistance. For example, when raising the bar during a bicep curl. Eccentric, also known as negative, is where the muscle contracts and lengthens to control the resistance. For for example when lowering the bar during a bicep curl. Isometric, also known, is where the muscle contracts to control the resistance but there is no change in length. For example, during a bicep curl, pausing at 90 degrees, holding the bar with no movement. Agonist. This is the prime mover during an exercise. With the bicep curl example, the prime mover would be the biceps. Antagonist. This is the muscle that relaxes to allow the agonist to contract. Again, using the bicep curl as an example, this would be the triceps. The triceps must relax in order for the biceps to contract during the bicep curl. Fixators. These are muscles which contract statically to stabilize another body part and prevent unwanted movement. The transversus abdominis is a big fixator. During most exercises that require any stabilization, the transversus abdominis helps to stabilize the spine and prevent unwanted movement. Synergists. This is a muscle which assists the main muscle in bringing about the action. For example, during a chest press, the chest muscles are the only muscles that are working. It's also assisted via the triceps. Different muscles bring about different joint actions. The deltoids are responsible for abduction, flexion and extension, horizontal flexion, horizontal extension, internal and external rotation of the shoulder joint. Biceps brachii are responsible for flexion of the elbow, supination of the forearm, and flexion of the shoulder. Triceps brachii are responsible for extension of the elbow, extension and abduction of the shoulder joint. The latissimus dorsi is responsible for several movements within the shoulder joint: adduction, extension, and internal rotation. The trapezius is responsible for several movements. The rhomboids are responsible for retraction and elevation of the scapula. The pectoralis major is responsible for flexion, horizontal flexion, adduction and internal rotation of the shoulder joint. The erector spinae is responsible for extension and lateral flexion of the spine. The rectus abdominis is responsible for flexion and lateral flexion of the spine and tilting the pelvis posteriorly. The internal obliques are responsible for rotation and lateral flexion of the spine. The external obliques are responsible for rotation and lateral flexion of the spine also. The transversus abdominis is responsible for compression and supporting the abdominal contents. It's considered a stabilizer of the spine. The diaphragm is responsible for increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Breathing. The intercostals elevate the ribs to aid inspiration and draw the ribs down to aid exhalation. Also breathing. The hip flexors are responsible for flexion and external rotation of the hip. The gluteus maximus is responsible for flexion and external rotation of the hip. The abductor group is responsible for abduction of the hip. The adductor group is responsible for adduction and internal rotation of the hip. The quadriceps group is responsible for flexion of the hip and extension of the knee. The hamstrings group is responsible for extension of the hip, flexion of the knee, and tilting the pelvis posteriorly. The gastrocnemius is responsible for plantar flexion of the ankle and flexion of the knee. The soleus is responsible for plantar flexion of the ankle. The tibialis anterior is responsible for dorsiflexion and inversion of the ankle. The origins and insertions of muscles. Skeletal muscles have recognisable ends fixed via tendons onto bones. The origin is from where the movement originates and remains static during contraction. It is normally the end located nearest to the midline of the body, also known as proximal. The insertion is the end which inserts into the bone, which moves during contraction. It is normally the end located furthest from the midline of the body, also known as distal. For example, a biceps brachii has an origin on the scapula. The insertion is on the radius. The muscle fibre types and their characteristics. Muscle fibres come in different types: slow twitch or type 1, intermediate or type 2A, fast twitch or type 2B. Now, slow twitch, also known as type 1, are generally red in colour. This is because they have a rich blood supply. They also have a small diameter. They favour aerobic activity due to the size of them, but also the high number of mitochondria. They do produce a low force when compared to type 2As or type 2Bs, but they are very slow to fatigue. Now, intermediate twitch or type 2A, they can develop characteristics of either slow twitch or fast twitch, depending on how they trained. Fast twitch or type 2B are white in colour. They have a much poorer blood supply, hence their colour, a much larger diameter, and they would favour anaerobic activity. They have a low number of mitochondria, produce high force, but are very quick to fatigue. Can you now identify the three types of muscle tissue, define the characteristics and functions of the three types of muscle tissue, describe the basic structure of skeletal muscle, name and locate the anterior skeletal muscles, name and locate the posterior skeletal muscles, describe the structure and function of the pelvic floor muscles, describe the different types of muscle action, identify the joint actions brought about by specific muscle groups, and identify skeletal fibre types and their characteristics. For more health and fitness education, visit www.stormfitnessacademy.co.uk. Slow twitch or type 1